Good afternoon. I hope you all have been enjoying the day's program. My name is Addie Rolnick, and I'm one of our Toll Public Interest Scholars here at Penn Law. When we first began planning this symposium, we knew we couldn't talk about the future of American democracy without discussing the role of the press in that democracy. Nelson Mandela, speaking to the International Press Institute in 1994, said, "Truth does indeed have immense power, yet it remains extremely elusive. No single person, no political or religious doctrine, no political party or government can claim to have a monopoly on truth." And because of this, he said, "A critical, independent, and investigative press is the lifeblood of any democracy." After this election, the state of the American press is perhaps more contested than it's ever been. Both candidates went months without holding press conferences, fake news became a buzzword, and President-elect Trump expressed an eagerness to change libel laws in order to make it easier to sue journalists. We are incredibly lucky to have with us here today Beth Donovan, a senior Washington editor for NPR News, to walk us through the current role played by media in American democracy and where news organizations like NPR will go from here. Beth leads NPR's coverage of politics and policy, leading an award-winning team of journalists covering the White House, Congress, the Supreme Court, and American politics. She has been guiding NPR's election coverage since 1996 and was instrumental in launching NPR's highly successful politics podcasts, which I highly recommend to anyone who hasn't heard them. After Beth's speech, we'll take questions from the audience for about 30 minutes. Please fill out a note card and hand it to one of our student volunteers at any point during the speech or the Q&A, and we'll answer them afterwards. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Beth Donovan.
Let me get situated here. Thank you very much for having me. It's very louder.
Yeah, I'm talking to the microphone.
Okay, is that better? Okay, maybe it's this one? Okay.
Great, I left my phone in class.
So thank you very much for having me. I have been an editor for the past 20 years. I'm someone who lives I'm a private person at NPR. There's so many public personalities out there, so I'm not always speaking at engagements like this. It was very generous of you to invite me. I will start by dropping a couple of big names that I think will interest everyone in the audience. Nina Totenberg is a member of our desk. I was emailing with her on my way here just today. Yay. And so Sam Sanders is the host of our politics podcast. And I was emailing with Sam as well. So I think that's got the generational sweep on NPR who's who and personalities. So when Adeline approached me, the topic that she presented was the role of the media in 2016. And I think the entire 2016 election and the role of the media, we are all suffering a bit of PTSD from the bombardment and the change and the revolution that we saw. And there are any number of topics or moments during this campaign where we could dedicate an entire hour-long conversation to, not the least of which is the press conference that we saw this week, Wednesday afternoon. That itself was worthy of a great deal of conversation. So I think what I would like to do here is step back a little bit and sort of set the table for how we got here and what the media environment we're operating in is, and then take questions on any one of the million data points over the past year and a half that I think we're all still puzzling and scratching our heads over if you haven't talked about them enough at your dinner table, in your living rooms, at the water cooler, and all things like that. And it strikes me as incredibly relevant that you would have a journalist speaking at a symposium like this. I think our two professions have a lot in common. And I think a lot of the struggles, I hope not, but I do wonder if a lot of the struggles that the media has faced over the past year will also come to your profession. When you think about lawyers and journalists, we write, we're thinkers, we're readers. Journalists try to understand and present all sides. Lawyers willingly step up and represent all sides. That's so much a part of our ethos. We're the guardrails on a democracy, our two professions. And I can think of one instance in the past year and a half where our two professions united and effective change in our society, and that was in Michigan. The uncovering of the water crisis in Flint came about by a collaboration from the lawyers at the ACLU of Michigan and Michigan Public Radio. That's how that data came to life, and that's how the stories came to life. That's how we found out how the government had let down that community, and that's how we gave voice to the people who were hurt there. So I can think of no greater example of the unity of our two professions and our common approach. We really are essential, both of us, for democracy. And another thing that unites us is, I think, a search for truth and a belief that facts matter. And here we are, entering a new era in American politics that was dubbed the post-factual era, the word of the year for 2016. And we all know what it means, and it's got a long history. It's been around for a very long time. I remember, I've been doing this long enough that the 1990s weren't that long, I remember covering them, and there was a lot of fake news then. I mean, we all remember Vince Foster and Hillary Clinton and Marcy Park, and multiple investigations shown that wasn't true. But it held on, and it stuck, and there was nothing we could do in the media to report. Lawyers on the various committees tried to expose, and it was there. But something has changed. Something really has changed. And it's not just in the media, it's in us. It's in our willingness to believe, or as a society. For me, as a journalist, the turning point, I think, was 2010. And that was when we were covering the healthcare bill. And I'm kind of one of those earnest, nerdy people who got into political journalism because I cared about policy and I care about people, and I'm curious and I want to hear all sides and all that. So and that's why I'm at NPR, right? So we tackled this in a very earnest way, and we were taking apart policy, and we were looking at how it affected people and doing our job as effectively as we could. And one of the things that was in the original bill, which I believe was called the Patient Protection and Affordability Act, something like that, was a provision that would have allowed physicians to be reimbursed for talking to their patients about end-of-life care. That's what it said. And public opinion would suggest that is what we want. And we all know what happened with that. Death panels, there's death panels. And again, we approached it, we're like, all right, we need to set the record straight. We're gonna explain what's in there. We did that, and I said, okay, well, let's look at the cost to society. I mean, I think there's 54 million Americans covered by Medicare. And as a nation, we spend $55 billion last year on Medicare. A quarter of that money went to the last year of our care. And I don't think you can find a person anywhere who says they want to spend their last 6 months hooked up to machines. There has to be a way to have this conversation. And yet, just this week, NPR, and so anyway, so we talked about that. And then another thing we talked about in trying to truth squad it was palliative care. And we tried to talk to doctors and expose what was involved and what it meant. That got nowhere. We explained that there were no death panels picking winners and losers. We did everything we earnestly could through an entire year trying to set that straight. I cannot tell you how many stories we did. And just this week, NPR and Ipsos partnered on a poll that showed 1/3 of Americans believe that the ACA has death panels. Honestly, we could not have done more stories, could not, without you all turning your radios off and saying, I never want to hear this network again. So it was with that backdrop, that was really searing for me. And it was with that backdrop, and look, there's a million debates we can have, and on the whole topic of end-of-life care and what's appropriate in the government role. That's all great, but the country couldn't engage a conversation. And so that inability to engage a conversation was the place where I began the planning for the 2016 election. And trying to make sense, what was the launching point with that as the background? Another thing, I'll digress, a few avenues of digression on our way to 2016. So when we think about, fake news and our inability to understand facts, one of the things everyone points to is the fractured news environment. It seems very quaint that at one point there were 3 broadcast networks and 3 wires, and that was the way in which America got national news. That was the only way. We had fantastic local papers all around the country, but it was really through the wires and the networks that we got our national news. And a lot of people point at the beginning, there was cable came in the early 80s, but people point to the big change being a change in the fairness doctrine, which had required everyone who held a broadcast license to cover controversial issues that were important to our society in a manner that is, quote, honest, equitable, and balanced. That was struck down in 1987. And that led to the rise of talk radio and the proliferation of media outlets. And I will say, on the one hand, I think it was kind of a wonderful thing. Who is the government to say what honest and equitable and balanced coverage is? As a journalist, I get that. Who should be the arbiter of that? And it led to a flowering of a whole lot of news organizations that we didn't have. And as the new media came up, there were different platforms and different approaches. It wouldn't have happened without that change. But it also gave rise to talk radio in the 90s. That was not fake news. It was riffing on news. And the liberal media and all these different sources of news, so that it all became fractured and everyone was able to cover their piece of the news. And everyone shares as a society now, the concern I expressed at the beginning, like who is the judge of what's honest and equitable and balanced? We all want to judge that. And as we moved into the 2000s and the early part of this decade, we've got social media. And all of a sudden, we all became the judge of that. And we have our Facebook pages and our Twitter feeds, which create our filter bubbles. And one by one, we're narrowing our universe, and we're only letting people in who share our views and share our values. And that's all the news we see. So into that environment, that's an easy slipstream for fake news to go into, because we're all walling off voices that we don't agree with. And everyone has an aunt or an uncle or something that they had to block. I get that. That's a different matter. So we have the fractured media environment. We have social media narrowing our voices. We have Americans' disbelief or difficulty getting through an agreement on what's facts. And that is how NPR walked up to 2016. And we thought about a lot of things, and some things are kind of usual that we do. How are we going to cover candidates? How are we going to cover issues? How are we going to cover the voters? And we came up with different game plans along the way. But one central one for me was trust. And that we needed to be cognizant that whatever we were doing and whatever ways we were experimenting as we approached 2016, that we would be cognizant of maintaining and enhancing the trust of our audience and expanding our audience. Because this is another problem the media faces. I can tell you at NPR, the average age of our listener is 49 years old. The New York Times average reader of their newspaper is 54 years old. Oh, actually, that's their digital. Their average newspaper is 60. The median age in the United States is 37. And obviously, the future is 12. So the average age of our news consumers, of what most of us, law students, lawyers, would consider the mainstream media, is old. And we are not the future. I put myself in that category. So in building trust and building audience for what I consider true, deep, meaningful, fact-driven journalism, those are my two of our important objectives. And a couple of the things we came up with that we wanted to, the way in which we can convey trust, one is the human voice. And if there are NPR listeners in the audience, that is what we have always done. We have always brought the voices of whether policymakers or voters or candidates to life. And there have been a number of studies that when I first started NPR I found really interesting. And they have people read comments, they have people watch them, same comments from the same people on TV, and they have you listen to them. And we are better at discerning truth by listening to the human voice. We can be distracted by words. They're written words and the sentences go this way. We can be distracted by images, whether people comport to certain values or whatever that we have, or biases. But in the human voice, we hear a register and a timbre that tells us something about someone's honesty and truthfulness. And that is a wonderful thing about working in radio. And I could go on and on about how much I love radio, and I hope you do too. So that was one thing we did, and we continued to do certain things that we had always done. Another cool thing that we did this year was when we tackled fact-checking. We decided we wanted to do fact-checking differently to get through some of the issues that I raised earlier. And through the end of 2015 and through most of the primaries, we were experimenting. We were trying different sound effects on the air. You probably don't remember them. They didn't work that well. We tried different things in the digital space. Because I didn't want to give, like if you give Pinocchios or buzzers or whatever, you become part of the political dialogue. Your content becomes weaponized. And I didn't want us to be weaponized. We're not coming down on a side. We're just giving context and factual background. So we were trying and experimenting, doing all these different things. And at some point in the late spring or early summer, one of our brilliant editors had the idea to take a speech that each of the candidates were doing, it must have been June because we were down to Clinton and Trump by then, and annotate it. Just get the speech, pull it out, and go through paragraph by paragraph with the experts across the breadth of the newsroom and have them say, well, that's true, but the context is this. That's not true, or here's the history. And just right within the document so that our audience could see the primary source material. They could see what we were working with. They could see how our journalism as part of a primary source material. And the first one came back, and it did pretty well on the website. I don't know, 70,000 clicks or something like this. And I was like, well, I like it. Let's do it again. So we did it again, and it was fine. We were doing okay. And some folks down in our Viz team, our data, our coders, and our visuals team saw it, and they were like, that's kind of cool. Can we work with you? Let's try to do it live. Let's annotate their speeches at the convention, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump's acceptance speeches. Let's annotate them live, we were doing a live radio broadcast. And during that live radio broadcast, side by side, we were producing a live digital product. So we had transcription service feeding us in the speech. We had the breadth of the newsroom in there, fact-checking, annotating, and we did really well. And our audience was really engaging, and we got a lot of positive feedback. And for me, it represented the very best of journalism. That is our role, to contribute to a more informed electorate, to share facts and figures with them. So this went on until we got to the debate, and I will say on the first presidential debate, we did a live fact check and live annotation, and we got 6 million clicks on it, which for us was awesome and incredible feedback. And just this week, and it's something we're continuing. Again, I think it's the transparency. I'm hoping it's building trust with our audience, and I hope it's building trust with office holders as well. They total transparency, names, footnotes, everything, and how we're interacting there. We did a live annotation of President-elect Trump's press conference this week, and we have nearly 1 million clicks on it as of this morning. So I'm hoping that we found something that is true to our core of who we are as journalists, and also meets our obligation, and is popular, because it matters. There's no point in speaking if no one's listening, right? So that was one of our things. Another thing that we did to try to engage trust with our audience was our podcast, and I'm suspecting that most of the law students are familiar with it. It's really been incredibly popular with younger audience. Our audience for our podcast is 70% under 35 and 25% under 25. And in the mainstream media, those are mind-blowing numbers. We are really reaching a different audience. And we did it by building on the same traditions of NPR journalism. It's deep reporting. It's a political roundtable. Roundtables are old as the hills. They go back forever. Ours is made up of a very diverse group of reporters, and their diversity is in gender, it's in faith, it's in race, and very importantly, their diversity is in experience. We had about half our group was covering either their first or second presidential election, and about half our group was at least on their third. Some of them have covered even more than I have. And that mix of ideas and the respect that they had for one another created a different kind of conversation. And as we went along, we allowed the journalists to lean into their humanity, to be people. There was no effort, no thought. This is not the voice of God out there telling you what happened on the road and what you should think about it. We were people, professionals, curious people out there privileged to cover the campaign, talking amongst ourselves. We had families, we had feelings. And it was a big risk to go into this space because the line between your humanity and your opinion is fine. And journalists are people. We have opinions. But we are professionals, like all of you. And so in the podcast, I think more than almost any other medium or journalistic effort I've seen, our journalists walk that line incredibly effectively. And I credit that voicing, and I'd be interested to hear from any of the law students or others who have listened to the pod. I think that is why we connected. It's not that our information was unique. You could turn on CNN and see what was happening. It's not like we're the most brilliant political journalists in the country. There are brilliant journalists at every news organization in the country. Or not everyone, but the main ones. At the New York Times and many other news organizations that were in the podcast space. But we had that really rare mix, and it worked. So for me, that was very gratifying, and I'm hoping we can find a toehold by keeping our focus. Maybe the annotation will go away, maybe the pod will go away. Things are changing so quickly and so rapidly. I don't know what we'll be doing 6 months from now. But I think as long as we can keep our focus on our trust relationship with our audience, and on the truth and a pursuit of facts, I think that we can connect, and I'm hopeful what we do will matter. So here we are, headed into a presidency unlike any that any of us have ever imagined. One of the products that we're going to roll out inauguration week. Right now it's called the Baseline Project. I don't know what it's going to be called when you see it on our website. What we're doing is we're establishing a set of facts. What is the unemployment rate? What is the uninsured rate? What is the carbon emission rate? So we have a common shared set of facts that we push off of and we all can agree on. It will be footnoted and annotated. And then we have the tweets. Just this morning, the president-elect tweeted 7 times, beginning at 6:20 in the morning, which is a little early for him. He usually starts around 6:40. And yes, I get alerts, as does every journalist, you know. And I wish I could say that I had a roadmap for what we're going to do and how we handle a presidency in a changing time like this. I don't know that I do. What I tell my team is that we're going to take every day as it comes. We're going to put one foot in front of the next. We're going to be true to our profession. We're going to be true to ourselves. America voted for him. And he will be the president of the United States. And his words matter. We will pay attention to his words. We will truth squad and annotate his words. We will be incredibly respectful of him and of the American people. That is the only way to do our job. When we saw the bashing of the media and, this one's nice and that one's not nice, like you walk into courtrooms, you deal with clients, you deal with all kinds of things, you stay true to your cause and your profession. In that regard, I'm hopeful it won't be hard. We know who we are. And we'll see what the next year holds. I can give you highlights on what he tweeted this morning, if you'd like. He started with his cabinet nominees differing from him. expressing their opinions. The allegations that were made against him were by his opponents. It's all fake news. He accused the intelligence, in quotation marks, of leaking the information against him. And I would be happy if there's a question to discuss what happened Monday night with the leaked reports and how that all went down. He talked about Hillary Clinton and why was her staff complaining about the FBI. He said she was guilty as hell, that she was campaigning in the wrong states, and then he pivoted to the Unaffordable Care Act, which will go next, which he's going to do next. So there we have it. It's going to be an interesting time. So I'm hoping there's a question or two to get started. I can definitely walk through the whole campaign, moment by moment. I'm seeing questions.
Oh yeah, tell about it.
I think that's kind of the best way to go because honestly, unless you want a whole hour on that press conference. Yeah.
Sorry. Well, first, thank you very much for.
I have a standing desk.
Okay, so I'll sit, so I don't feel awkward. Feel free to continue filling out questions and passing them down as we do this discussion. So thank you very much for your speech, and I'll start with a complimentary question, which I suspect is from a law student. The NPR Politics podcast saved my sanity during the election. It was smart, human, and funny. Do you think, as America moves from political season to policy making, that the shift in content might make some of your audience, particularly the younger audience, tune out?
That is something we think a lot about, and we've thought a lot about, and I hope not. I'm sure our audience is going to fall off. It always does. Every news organization, the numbers go up. Back when it was, just newspapers and just radio, our digital numbers, everything goes up in election, and it does fall off. I can tell you that thus far, we have seen pretty high sustained engagement. Last week, this is probably proprietary, but it's not going to get published till the end of May, whatever. We're still getting about 500,000 uniques a week. So that's 500,000 people that are downloading the podcast. I'd like to think most of them are listening, and many of them all the way through. We also have a change in our staff because our staff expands for an election year, and it will contract in a non-election year. So some of our fan favorites, Asma and Sam, are going on to different projects. Asma's going back to her husband in Boston. Sam is going on to pursue a different project at NPR. And it will get kind of geeky, and it will get in the weeds. And that will be harder. Those are harder things, but I'm hoping that we've engaged a younger audience and that they'll stick with us and that they have come to us because of the humanity and because they do care, because we did not just talk about the tweets the entire election season. We did also attempt to talk about the policy issues and implications. And I think we're going to do something, if not next week, the week after. We're really going to take apart the ACA and we're just going to go at it. And what we've said about the podcast is we will be there as long as the audience is there. And if the audience changes for that, we will put our nose to the grindstone. We're going to come up with another product, another package to engage people. So stick with us. I hope it works. But, we're ready. We'll adapt.
Good. And I should note that in addition to great policy analysis, the Politics Podcast had a fantastic musicals episode, which I highly commend to all of your attention.
One of the favorites.
Yeah. So our next question, in the wake of the election, we saw increased coverage of many groups that are considered hate groups, such as the alt-right conference held in D.C. How do you balance covering these issues with giving these groups potential credibility?
That goes right at the heart of it. I mean, ignoring their existence is not helpful. These voters are there, these people are there, these voices are out there. At NPR, we are cognizant of hate speech. We're very cognizant of this issue. We don't want to give voice or rise to hate speech. But we cover America. And so we try to wait for moments where there are gatherings of significance. We don't go searching out isolated voices of hate. But when there are gatherings, we cover them. When there are hate crimes, we cover them. That is all that we can do. But it is something we are aware of, and it's a conversation in our newsroom and in every newsroom across the country. I live down the street from Comet Ping Pong, so I have seen what happens when some of this, and my kids have eaten there, and it's right next door to Politics and Prose bookstore, for any of you who are familiar with DC. So it has real world consequences. It's not like an isolated random thing. But I think, I look back and I wonder if not covering, not giving voice. I mean, when you talk to a lot of the most challenging elements of the Trump constituency, they feel they were silenced, that political correctness told them they were bad people and they weren't allowed to think and feel. And it bubbled up into this place. So there's something went wrong in our conversation as a society. We're not going to give voice to hate speech. We don't do hate speech on our air. We do cover the news and we do cover the American people. It's very unsatisfying, but
No, it sounds like a complicated calculus to go through every day. Sort of along similar lines, we have a question from someone who remembers a more unified and perhaps homogenous media environment that says they seriously worry that we no longer have any common experience to bind us together as a country. I love the patchwork quilt quality of this country, but we need some common experience. Can news provide it? And if not, what will?
I don't know. That's a really interesting question. It's something I've thought a lot about. I had a brief stint at the Pew Research Center, and one of the reports I worked on was the impact of collective memory and how important that is for us as a society. That things like JFK's assassination for a certain generation, the Challenger explosion for another generation, 9/11 for millennials. Those were moments where, at those key times, we got our news from one place, or by 9/11 we're getting our news from a lot of places, but we had a common set of facts so that we came away with a common memory. And we were bound as a society by that common moment. I mean, that goes back, the collective memory defines generations, and it defines I could go on and on about how it shapes and informs each generation and their political meanings and their value system based on these collective experiences. But I don't know that we have that anymore. I mean, things happen now. Take this election. We don't have a common memory of this election. We have two memories of this election. We have two radically different views in this country of what happened on Tuesday, November 8th. So what is our shared moment from here? I think that is, I don't know that the media can provide that. I don't know, and I think, I know at NPR, we don't want to speak to two Americas or one piece of one America. We have stations all across the country. We have been a vital link to places when there wasn't cable, where there still isn't broadband access. Everybody still has a radio. Worst comes to worst, you get in your car, you turn it on, you find out what the weather is, and you find out what's going on in the world. So we have been a vital link, and we are all in our newsroom aware of our role here. But I don't know where we go from here. I don't know what it means that every single thing that happens has a red and a blue version. I actually believe there are facts, and there could be a common story. Whether as a society we're ready to hear it and absorb it, I don't know. Sorry again.
No, thank you. I don't think anyone has the answers here, at least not yet. So we got quite a few questions, and here come more, about this issue of facts and truth, and I think it's sort of what's on all our minds today, and I think this question gets at it well. Can you talk about the tension in your job between reporting news in an unbiased manner and reporting on whether candidates are speaking truthfully about facts and events?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that, to me, is not that complicated. I mean, if you say that, well, here's an example where it is complicated. Donald Trump said that he saved 1,000 jobs by having carriers stay in Indiana. Well, one, how much did Donald Trump have to do with that? Actually, I think probably a lot. I mean, I think that the announcement went the way it did, and Mike Pence negotiated a deal that actually did have an impact. So, like, part of me is like, honestly, the President of the United States is doing a mayor's job, securing jobs. His vice president negotiated a deal. Like, so I'm having all these different thoughts. But I know for a fact that only 450 jobs were actually saved, because some of them were doing this and some of them were doing that. And I can also tell you that by dwelling on 450 jobs versus 1,000 jobs, if that's what the media does, and we all did a little of it, what we did was that we alienated everyone who heard that, because that felt picayune. That felt unimportant. What, to the people in that community, jobs had been saved and somebody cared about them. And so this is the way in which it becomes complicated. That when we are digesting and nitpicking facts, look, if it's a big fact, like you say, the unemployment rate is at historic highs, when actually it's at a near, it's considered as low as it can get in a healthy economy, that we should try to set the record straight on. But in doing so, it's alienating. It's reinforcing to the people who want to say, oh yeah, that Donald Trump, he lies all the time. But it's alienating to a lot of people who care about their jobs. So that is where we have to believe in facts. We have to report the facts. We have to stick to them. But we have to be aware of our trust relationship with our audience. And so we have to deliver the facts and frame them in a way that really reflects just an honest pursuit of a common truth as best we can. Because getting everybody to turn off the radio or throw down the New York Times or never go to this website again and further narrow their filter bubble doesn't help get us toward the collective memory or things that could bring us together. So even that is going to get hard.
Thank you for that. And I appreciated what you said earlier about some of the similarities between journalists and lawyers. And I think another similarity is that lawyers tend to believe that as long as we get the law and the policy right, social change will follow. And sometimes journalists believe that as long as we tell people the facts, social change will follow. And clearly that hasn't been happening recently, or maybe ever. So what will get social change to follow?
Well, I don't know that our job is to have
Yes,
social change, and
of
I would say
course.
there is dramatic
Yeah.
social change happening
Well,
right now.
yes. Yeah.
Our job is to contribute to a more informed electorate, so that when people go to the polls, they have the information that they need. One of the challenges is at least 40% of American adults don't vote. And when that share of people don't vote, you don't know what 60% is going to show up, and it moves this way and it moves that way. And then even the issue of expanding the vote is now controversial. It has a red and a blue version. Some countries like Australia have mandatory voting. That would be an interesting thing in our country. It's super un-American to have anything mandatory. The only thing that's allowed to be mandatory, I think, is a driver's license. I have not heard any controversy on that topic, but I'm sure it will come. So anyway, there's a lot of social change happening.
Yeah. That was a misspeak on my part. I apologize.
But I don't know that I do agree in that I don't know that we're contributing to a more informed electorate.
Yeah.
We may be contributing to a more polarized electorate, despite, in the case of NPR, and I think the Washington Post and the New York Times and many, many other news organizations, our very best efforts.
Yeah. On a similar note, we just got a question about how fact-checking Trump, in other words, this question did not seem to make a difference, perhaps did not seem to change the way the electorate viewed information. Could anything have been done differently, or could news organizations do anything differently in the future to better inform the electorate when just fact-checking might not be enough?
Again, in a free media, in a free society, people are going to do what they're going to do. That's the American way, right? I guess from my perspective, and I think from many people's, our over-reliance on polls and the analysis of polls. I've worked in polling. I started at the CBS News Election Survey Unit, so it was my first grounding, and I've done, as I said, work for Pew. I know enough about polls to know that they are an art. And their goal was never to tell us who was going to win and who was going to lose an election. Their goal was always to inform us about attitudes on issues. And I believe they still can do that. People have talked about the over-reliance on polls for a very long time, and this time we got to the point where the poll of polls were predicting the likelihood of an outcome, which moved it from, if everyone had focused all along on, this is a 3-point race. I'm sorry, there's a 3 or 4 point margin of error. A 3 or 4 point margin of error means you add or subtract 3 points to each person's number. So if there's a gap of less than 6 or 8 points between candidates, it's a dead heat. You don't know what's happening. But because we even stopped looking at those numbers and what we were looking as a 90% chance of one person's winning, I think as journalists, I'd like to think we didn't look at them, but we're human. I know as a country, people looked at them. I know the people who felt Donald Trump was going to win felt that reflected a super biased media that was making those things up. I can explain the formula, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it wasn't made up out of whole cloth. Whether it was a good science, I think we'd all take issue with now. I think we just have to be cognizant of the purpose of polls and see if we can get back to them. I think that's one thing we can do better. I know we did try on NPR to limit the number of times you heard us talk about polls. You probably didn't notice it in the media onslaught, and we did talk about polls from time to time. There were very, very few discussions of horse race polls on our air.
That's very interesting. Thank you. We've gotten 2 questions on the release of the Trump file this week. Dossier. And one person says something interesting, and I think I felt this too this week. It was frustrating to read in the New York Times that all journalists and all in Washington already knew about it. So was it right, and did we, as the public, have a right or any kind of privilege to know about that?
Well, there you have it. NPR did get, this is on the record, so I don't exactly know how to, if it was not on the record, I would just tell you it's, but we had seen it. And you've now all seen it. It's on BuzzFeed. I'm sorry, if you read that, that does not read like an intelligence file. That reads like an opposition research file. That doesn't mean there's not intelligence in it. That doesn't mean it's not rooted in something. But if you read that, that reads like a political document. It just does. So when you get documents like that, which the media does all the time, what you do is you report it. You try to, the same thing you all do. You try to find out what's true. It's hard. There's nothing easy about what we do. We did not have it for months, like other news organizations, but we did have it. No one has yet found something that they can corroborate, that they have on the record from someone you would believe the things that are in there. We don't publish that. We don't, and we never will, as long as the current NPR exists. I do not agree with what BuzzFeed did. What CNN did is a different matter. And interestingly, I had not been aware that we had the document. It was in the investigative unit, which is where it should be, because it was that's where it should be before. It needs to have some grounding before it comes to the political team, right? When the CNN story broke, what the CNN story said was that the President of the United States and the President-elect had been briefed on a 2-page dossier on allegations of information that the Russians had collected about Donald Trump. When that story broke, we were called into a meeting with some of the key decision makers at NPR. And we were talking about what to do, and we were devising a different kind of reporting strategy. We were going to bring in more reporters. Our questions were going to be, does this 2-page dossier exist? Were the president and president-elect briefed on it? what does intelligence think about this? Did they believe that this was true, and that's why they briefed them? Or did they feel the president and the president-elect had a right to know? Those were our 3 reporting questions, and because you need to establish 3 questions, some number of questions, as I don't need to tell lawyers, you do this all the time, things where you can get to a yes or a no answer so that you can actually get answers to things and progress. An answer to any one of those 3 things would have been reportable information for us. We would have gone, if the president-elect of the United States is briefed on something like this, that's news, that's legit. And I know to the public that can seem like splitting hairs. Glad to argue it. It doesn't to me, putting out salacious allegations versus the president-elect has been briefed on allegations and the president of the United States. While we were in that meeting, and like no sooner had we gone through a reporting strategy so that we could go out and we could figure out, we had nothing on our website, nothing on our newscast at that point. While we were in there, BuzzFeed released it. I will tell you, I didn't even have in my hand in that meeting a copy of it. No one ever gave me a copy at NPR of that document, nor anybody at the Washington desk. We sort of established boundaries of what we needed to know to proceed. And the investigative unit and our reporter in Moscow and others, the national security team, were going through the particulars. The BuzzFeed document was out there, and we all went and printed it and read it. And most of it had been in the rumor mill. I'm sure half of it you guys had heard somewhere. Some was out there in the ether. And we went and reported it, and Mary Louise Kelly was able to confirm that the president and president-elect had been briefed on it, and that there was a 2-page dossier, and that is what we have reported on. By BuzzFeed, those things are true. By BuzzFeed releasing absolute, I mean, there's just no one has proven anything in there. By putting that out for everyone, I think it damages all of us. I think it damages all of the media. It led to the sideshow that press conference was. I know Ben Smith was here. I would love to talk to him. He is a good journalist. And I don't mean to diminish all the work that they've done. It's a legitimate debate. I know maybe many of you here feel BuzzFeed did the right thing. We're going to encounter many, many occasions like this. And I think the standards will change. And in a way, you can throw my own words back at me when we're live annotating speeches, when we're putting our fact-checking and our analysis and our context in a primary source document. We are trying to bring you the transparency that BuzzFeed talked about by releasing that. So it's all going to be splitting hairs. I do think I mean, when Jim Acosta being shouted down, I thought Jim Acosta he's a wonderful reporter. I don't know, I thought it was kind of rude. I don't know. I don't think it made the media look good. I don't think it's good for the media, though, to be in a shouting match with the president-elect of the United States. I don't think we get to a common set of truths or facts in that environment. So this will go on, and the reporting on this will continue. And the head of the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee did say yesterday that he's not going to investigate these allegations. I think there should be an investigation of these allegations, especially now that they're out there. People have a right to know if this is all just garbage, as the president-elect says, and what his interests are in Russia. I do think the public has a right to know those things. And the best way to get at them would be an investigation. And if it's not by the United States Congress, it will be by news organizations, and it will be by lawyers.
Thank you. Sounds like we have a lot of excitement to look forward to. And so we've had a few questions about the challenges of covering President-elect Trump as a president, sort of like no other we've ever had. And so we've had a request to talk about the recent press conference that he held this week, but I also hope you'll talk about what his presidency means for how we cover the presidency more broadly.
Well, part of that depends on the kind of access we get. And access has changed and been restricted with each succeeding presidency. Barack Obama did an awful lot to restrict the access to the President of the United States. There are numerous environments where in a previous administration we would have anticipated a press photographer bearing witness on behalf of the American people, or at least a wire reporter bearing witness on behalf of the American people, where it was closed. The only camera in the room was controlled by the President of the United States. He held a limited number of press conferences. This is a long trajectory, and I can only assume that our access will be further limited under the next administration, and that didn't begin with Donald Trump, and it's not going to end with Donald Trump. And it will be dependent on the American people to decide what kind of access and to contribute to making sure that the media secures continued access. The White House Correspondents Association had a meeting last night. I wasn't there to talk about things like the press room. And this is a legitimate conversation. I think there are 30 or 40 seats in the press room. Early on, when the press room was first built, I want to say it was in the Reagan era, the press secretary decided who sat in the front row and the back row, and he moved people around and all this. And pretty quickly, the White House was like, whoa, this is not what we want to do. And they gave it to the White House Correspondents Association. And the White House Correspondents Association has decided who sits in what seat. NPR is in the middle of the second row. We have a little plaque on our chair. But I don't know. I sure don't want the president deciding who's in what chair, but honestly, who is the arbiter? Who should have those seats? Should the networks and the cables be in the front row? I'm here to say that Cheddar.com might not be ready for a seat in the White House briefing room. They did get a question at the news conference, but these are the really tough issues that we are wrestling with as a society. Who should determine who's in those seats? Who has a right to them? Who has a right to ask questions of the press secretary and the President of the United States in our pluralistic, open society? These are all really important and really difficult questions. Another challenge that, I think this should change. The ways in which the press has been briefed on what's going on in the White House. At different times there was what's called a gaggle. And a gaggle is where the wires and the nets and a couple of key newspapers, pool reporters, where a press pool is like all the newspapers. Oh, okay. There's one, thank you, 5 minutes left. One newspaper represents all newspapers. One radio network represents all radios. So they gather the pool, and the press secretary would do a gaggle, and he's telling you what's going on. It's on background, no quotes, but you have that information to inform your audience of what's happening at the White House and in the government that day. And then it moved to be on camera, and then it moved to the press room, and it was on the record, and then sometime after 9/11, it went on camera. And now it's like a sideshow every day. Are we better off by having that on camera every day and having everyone watch that? I don't know. It has changed the dialogue. It's changed the questions. I sure don't want to shut it down, but I don't know that it's made us better. And I am almost certain the Trump administration will make some changes in the kind of access we get in those things. I'm for all access, but I don't know that what we have now is making us better.
Thank you for that. I think we might have time for 2 more questions.
I'll try to be quicker than I've been on all these.
No, this is great. And I apologize for not getting to everyone's questions, but I hope we're getting at the general themes. So I know during this election, the New York Times made the decision to say Trump had lied when they made that call. And I believe NPR decided not to use that language. Could you talk a little bit about that decision?
Yes, it was a robust conversation in our newsroom about what to do and what was the right thing to do, as there has been on so many issues. I mean, newsrooms are great places, probably like law firms, where you're really debating these core philosophical things. So some people wanted to, even before the New York Times, use the word liar. That a lie is an intentionally told falsehood. And if things have been corrected and it's changed, and that might be legitimately called a lie. Our ombudsman was like, a lie suggests intent. You have to be inside a person's head to know what their intent was. We do not have that ability. We try never to say, someone feels this way or they think this. We try always to say what they say and what they did. So using the word lie is outside our norms, and that is the primary reason why we didn't use it. Even if the newsroom had gone a different direction, I can tell you for our desk, and for the political coverage we did, I would not have wanted to use it, and I would have discouraged us from using it very often had it been approved. Because I think it's one of those words that is alienating. If we are calling someone a liar when we are actually not inside their heads, I think people will stop listening to us. And again, it is my ambition to contribute to a more informed electorate, not a more informed slice of an electorate. So I'm very comfortable with that choice. It's a debate. That's just where I came down on it.
Thank you. Okay, I think we do have time. This will be my last question. So during this campaign, we saw President-elect Trump personally target some journalists, and most recently we saw a shouting match at the press conference this week. And one of our audience members asked whether you think the press will coalesce in some show of unity in this atmosphere.
Well, that's been, we've not had a conversation about that in the newsroom, but I've been reading some of the coverage. And I think the White House Correspondents Association will try to come together and to stand united for some common principles in terms of access and openness and transparency that we get in the White House. I do think you will see that. Again, like everything, there's a risk of people seeing that who disagree, the lamestream media. We have to take care. We have to use our power and our very carefully, both because it's the right thing to do and because we need to maintain our trust relationship with our audience in order to have an effect. So it's going to be an interesting. It's going to be an interesting 4 years, that is for sure. And it is an absolute tsunami of news. Every day there are 10 topics out there, any one of which we could address with seriousness of purpose. And I can tell you we will do our best to pick a few topics where we can dig in and develop some expertise and follow some through lines and do some deep reporting. I think hopping from lily pad to lily pad to lily pad doesn't serve our interest, but we need media on all of those lily pads, because most all of the things that are being talked about right now are really important. We've talked about the tweets. Time's up.
No, finish your thoughts, please.
And the Constitution of the United States is something that is important, and we will address even a 6 a.m. tweet that affects the Constitution of the United States.